The worst mistake people make is believing they have already won. That was the last thing my father ever told me about land, and for years I never truly understood what he meant. I understood it the morning my wife squeezed my hand from a hospital bed while another round of chemotherapy slowly dripped into her arm. She looked exhausted, but she still managed to smile and tell me everything would be all right. I smiled back because she needed hope more than honesty. My phone vibrated 3 times before I finally looked at it. The first notification was from the bank. The second came from my attorney. The third was from the Homeowners Association. By the time I finished reading the final email, I realized they had done it. The HOA had officially taken our home while my wife was still fighting cancer. Months earlier, I had fallen behind after medical bills consumed every dollar we had saved. I asked for time. I explained our situation. I even attended every meeting they required, hoping someone would show a little compassion. Instead, every conversation ended with another fee, another penalty, another deadline. They never raised their voices. They simply followed procedures that slowly pushed us toward losing everything. 2 days later I drove back from the hospital to collect the last of our belongings. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always had. Children rode bicycles along clean sidewalks. Sprinklers watered perfectly trimmed lawns. Neighbors waved politely without realizing I was packing up the final pieces of my family's life. I filled my pickup truck with photo albums, a few boxes of clothes, my wife's favorite quilt, and the old fireproof safe my father had kept locked inside the garage for as long as I could remember. Most people would have left it behind because it was heavy, scratched, and looked almost worthless. My father had always said, "Whatever happens, never leave this behind." I had never asked why. As I loaded the safe into the truck, I noticed HOA President Linda Morrison standing across the street with 2 board members. They were smiling while pointing toward my house as if discussing renovation plans instead of watching someone lose his home. She walked over and politely reminded me that everything left inside after 5 o'clock would legally belong to the association. Her voice was calm, almost cheerful, which somehow made it hurt even more. I simply nodded because arguing would change nothing. Before leaving, I turned around one last time. I expected to feel anger, but what I actually felt was confusion. Linda glanced at the old safe sitting in the bed of my truck, and for just a second her confident smile disappeared. It returned almost immediately, but I noticed it. That tiny reaction stayed with me all afternoon. Later that evening I brought the safe to my attorney's office because I needed somewhere secure to store it while I stayed near the hospital. The moment he saw the faded nameplate attached to the front, his expression changed. He ran his fingers across the rusted metal and quietly asked where I had gotten it. When I told him it had belonged to my father, he stared at me for several long seconds before saying something I will never forget. "Daniel, if this safe still contains what I think it does, the HOA may have celebrated far too soon." My attorney carefully set the old safe on a conference table without saying another word. He asked his assistant to close the office door and cancel every appointment for the next hour. That alone told me this was more serious than I had imagined. He handed me the small brass key that had been taped beneath the safe for decades. I had never even noticed it before. When I unlocked the heavy door, the hinges groaned softly, revealing several neatly wrapped folders protected inside waterproof envelopes. On top rested a handwritten note from my father. It read, "If anyone ever questions this land, do not trust copies. Trust what was recorded first." I looked up in confusion, but my attorney was already opening the first envelope. Inside were original survey maps, property descriptions, and official county recording stamps dating back more than 40 years. Everything appeared authentic, yet I still did not understand why any of it mattered now. He spread the documents across the table and compared them with digital property records on his computer. After several silent minutes, he leaned back in his chair and quietly said, "Daniel, your house and your land may not have been treated as the same property." Those words completely changed how I viewed everything that had happened. For months I believed the fight had been about unpaid HOA assessments. Now it seemed there could be something much larger hiding beneath the surface. My attorney explained that the original survey showed an additional parcel extending well beyond the fenced backyard. According to these older records, that section had never been transferred into the subdivision during its original development. Modern maps displayed it as if it naturally belonged to the neighborhood, but the recorded legal description suggested something very different. Before either of us celebrated, he warned me that old documents alone would never be enough. We needed confirmation from someone who understood the original surveys. The next morning we drove nearly 60 miles to visit Harold Bennett, a retired county surveyor who had spent decades reviewing property boundaries before retiring. His workshop was filled with rolled maps, measuring equipment, and shelves packed with faded record books. Harold studied the survey in complete silence, adjusting his glasses several times before walking to an old cabinet and pulling out another large map. He laid both documents side by side and immediately pointed to a narrow strip running along the edge of my family's property. "This is what everyone forgot," he said. He explained that decades earlier the developer had planned an expansion that was never completed, leaving one parcel under the original owner's recorded ownership instead of transferring it into the Homeowners Association. Harold could not legally declare ownership himself, but he believed the county archives might still contain the original supporting filings. As we prepared to leave, he stopped me at the door. "Do not wait," he warned. "If there is going to be a legal hearing, you need certified copies before anyone realizes what you are looking for." My attorney checked his calendar and frowned. The court hearing over the remaining property issues had already been scheduled for 5 days later. The countdown had officially begun, and for the first time since losing my home, I realized the HOA might not actually understand what they had taken, or what they had failed to take. The drive back from Harold Bennett's workshop felt completely different from the one that had brought us there. For the first time in months, I was not thinking about everything I had lost. I was thinking about what everyone else might have overlooked. My attorney kept repeating the same sentence. "Do not assume they know what you know." That warning stayed with me because Linda Morrison had always acted far too confident. If the HOA understood those original surveys, they would never have rushed to push my family out so quickly. The following morning I went to the county planning office while my attorney requested certified copies from the recorder's archive. I expected a routine visit, but instead I noticed several large display boards showing a proposed expansion for the neighborhood. Curious, I walked over and studied the drawings. A brand new entrance road, additional homes, walking trails, and a commercial corner were all planned for land surrounding the subdivision. Then I saw something that immediately caught my attention. The only access road connecting the future development to the state highway crossed directly through the parcel Harold had identified on my father's survey. I stared at the map for several seconds before asking a planning employee whether there was another entrance. She shook her head. "Not unless someone buys additional land from neighboring owners," she replied. My heart started racing. Until that moment I believed the HOA simply wanted to collect unpaid assessments and move on. Now the entire situation looked completely different. Without that narrow strip of land, the expansion shown on the public proposal could not legally move forward. I quietly took a public information brochure and left without asking another question. Outside, I called my attorney. He arrived less than 20 minutes later. After comparing the planning brochure with my father's survey, he became unusually quiet. "Daniel," he finally said, "they may not have been chasing your house at all. They may have been trying to eliminate the biggest obstacle standing in front of a multi-million-dollar project." That possibility completely changed how I viewed every letter, every fine, and every deadline the HOA had sent over the past year. We immediately searched public development filings and discovered that a private builder had recently signed a preliminary agreement with the community, pending final infrastructure approval. The documents did not mention my name, but every proposed roadway aligned almost perfectly with the disputed parcel. That afternoon another surprise arrived. While I was visiting my wife at the hospital, my attorney called again. He had received confirmation that certified archive records would be available the next morning, only 3 days before the court hearing. Before hanging up, he added one more piece of information that neither of us expected. A former HOA administrative employee had contacted his office after hearing questions were being asked about the old property records. She claimed she had kept copies of internal correspondence because something about the board's decisions had never felt right. She refused to discuss details over the phone, insisting we meet in person. As I looked at my wife peacefully resting after treatment, I realized the case was no longer just about recovering dignity or protecting family history. Someone inside the HOA might already know the truth, and if that former employee was willing to talk, the people who believed they controlled the entire story were about to lose control of it. The former HOA employee agreed to meet us in a small family diner just outside the county line early the next morning. My attorney chose the location because it was quiet and far enough away from the neighborhood that no one would recognize her. When she walked through the front door, she looked around twice before sitting down across from us. Her name was Susan Parker, and she had worked as the administrative assistant for the HOA board for nearly 12 years before retiring. She did not waste time with small talk. She placed a thick manila envelope on the table and said, "I have been waiting a long time for someone to ask the right questions." My attorney carefully opened the envelope. Inside were printed emails, meeting agendas, handwritten notes, and copies of legal correspondence that had never appeared in the official board minutes we had previously obtained. Susan explained that during her final years with the association she had been responsible for organizing archived records before board meetings. One particular issue kept appearing every few years whenever developers discussed expanding the community. Every time it surfaced, the board's attorney warned that one parcel had never been legally transferred into HOA ownership. According to Susan, those warnings were always acknowledged privately but never discussed during open meetings. She slid one email across the table. It came from the HOA's outside legal counsel nearly 6 years earlier. The message clearly advised the board not to rely on planning maps as proof of ownership because recorded property documents controlled legal boundaries. My attorney read the message twice before quietly placing it back on the table. Susan then showed us something even more surprising. She had copied a board meeting agenda that referenced a supporting resolution confirming the attorney's recommendation. The resolution number appeared on the agenda, but when we searched the official records months earlier, that resolution did not exist. It had simply disappeared from the public files. "I always believed someone removed it after the meeting," Susan admitted. "I could never prove it, but I knew something was wrong." Before leaving, she handed us one final document. It was a handwritten checklist prepared for a closed executive session. Next to one item someone had written, "Delay ownership discussion until development negotiations are complete." No names appeared beside the note, but the timing matched the period when the subdivision expansion first entered preliminary planning. My attorney immediately requested certified archive copies from the county recorder before anyone else could access the files. Later that afternoon, the recorder called with unexpected news. While searching older storage boxes, employees had located additional archived index books that had not yet been digitized. One entry referenced the same missing resolution number Susan had shown us, but the actual supporting document was stored in an off-site preservation facility, and could not be delivered until the following morning, less than 48 hours before the court hearing. As we left the recorder's office, my attorney smiled for the first time since I had lost my home. "If that archived resolution says what I think it says," he told me, "this case will stop being about unpaid assessments. It will become a question of whether the board knowingly ignored its own legal advice." At that moment I realized the courtroom battle ahead was no longer simply about proving my rights. It might expose how long the truth had been hidden and who had benefited from keeping it buried. The morning of the hearing began with a phone call that changed everything before I even stepped into the courthouse. My attorney answered with the recorder's office on speaker. After 2 days of searching an off-site preservation facility, they had located the archived resolution Susan believed had disappeared years earlier. It had never been destroyed. It had simply been filed under an obsolete indexing system that nobody had checked until now. Less than an hour later, a county employee personally delivered a certified copy to my attorney's office. We opened the envelope together. The resolution did not transfer ownership of my family's land to the Homeowners Association as everyone had assumed for years. Instead, it officially acknowledged the board's legal opinion that the disputed parcel remained under its original recorded ownership until a separate easement agreement could be negotiated. My attorney looked directly at me and quietly said, "Daniel, this is no longer just evidence. This changes the foundation of their entire argument." We drove to the courthouse in complete silence. As we entered the courtroom, Linda Morrison sat confidently beside the HOA's attorney, greeting board members as though the outcome had already been decided. She glanced at me briefly before returning to her conversation without the slightest concern. That confidence disappeared only after my attorney handed certified copies of the newly recovered resolution to the court clerk. I noticed Linda leaning toward her attorney as both of them quickly turned through the pages. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, I saw genuine uncertainty on her face. The hearing began with the HOA repeating the same position they had relied on for months. They argued that subdivision maps, neighborhood maintenance records, and long-standing use established their authority over the disputed property. Their presentation sounded polished, and several exhibits displayed modern planning maps that appeared convincing at first glance. Then my attorney stood and calmly introduced the original recorded survey, the certified archived documents, the legal opinion uncovered by Susan's records, and finally the recovered county resolution. One by one, each document showed the same conclusion. Planning maps illustrated intended development, but they did not transfer legal ownership. Recorded property documents controlled title, and none of those records granted the HOA ownership of my family's parcel. The judge carefully reviewed every exhibit without interrupting. Then he asked a single question that instantly changed the atmosphere inside the courtroom. "Can the association produce a recorded easement or recorded conveyance granting legal access across this parcel?" The HOA attorney requested several moments to review additional files. Board members quietly searched through folders while Linda whispered urgently with her legal team. Minutes passed. Finally, the attorney stood and admitted they could not locate any recorded easements supporting their position. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced during the entire case. The judge did not announce a final ruling that afternoon, but he made one observation before ending the session that no one in the courtroom would forget. He stated that planning assumptions and decades of routine use could not replace properly recorded property rights. As everyone slowly gathered their papers, I expected Linda to leave immediately. Instead, she remained seated, staring at the certified resolution that had just dismantled years of certainty. Outside the courtroom, my attorney received another unexpected call. A county transportation official wanted to speak with us immediately because the disputed parcel had suddenly become the most important piece of land in the entire development project. When people walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, everyone believed the biggest surprise had already happened. They were wrong. My attorney and I followed the county transportation official into a conference room where several planning maps were already spread across a large table. He greeted us politely and pointed directly at the disputed parcel on one of the drawings. "Everything stops here," he said. He explained that every approved traffic study, emergency access review, and utility plan depended on a permanent legal route across my family's land. Without it, the county could not authorize the next phase of construction because emergency vehicles would not have guaranteed access to hundreds of planned homes. Suddenly the narrow strip my father had protected for decades was no longer an overlooked piece of property. It had become the key to an entire development worth millions of dollars. My attorney asked the question that everyone else seemed afraid to ask. Did the developer know this parcel was never transferred? The transportation official answered carefully. He explained that the county reviewed applications based on documents submitted by developers and property owners. Ownership disputes were expected to be resolved before final approvals. In other words, everyone had assumed the HOA possessed legal authority without verifying the recorded title. As we left the meeting, my telephone began ringing nonstop. Friends I had not heard from in months suddenly wanted to know what had happened inside the courtroom. Neighbors who had barely spoken to me while I was packing my belongings were now asking if the rumors were true. By evening, Local discussion groups were filled with questions about whether the entire expansion project might collapse. The following morning brought another unexpected change. Several HOA board members called a special meeting that had not been scheduled before the hearing. According to public notices, they planned to discuss legal strategy and future development. Linda Morrison did not appear outside afterward to speak with residents, as she normally did. Instead, board members left separately, avoiding questions from homeowners waiting in the parking lot. Later that afternoon, Susan Parker called my attorney again. She had heard from former coworkers that the atmosphere inside the HOA office had completely changed. People were no longer discussing how to defend the association. They were arguing about who had ignored the legal warnings years earlier. Some believed the board had relied too heavily on planning maps. Others claimed certain documents had intentionally been kept out of public discussions to avoid delaying negotiations with developers. That evening my attorney received notice that the judge would issue a written decision within days, but he also warned me that the legal battle might not end there. Winning ownership would only answer one question. It would not solve the larger problem created by the failed development plans. As I drove to the hospital to spend the evening with my wife, I realized everything had shifted again. Only a week earlier I had been searching for temporary housing while wondering how to rebuild my life. Now the same organization that had treated me like an obstacle was facing a crisis that only I could resolve. Just before I reached the hospital parking lot, my phone rang once more. The caller identified herself as the executive assistant to the developer leading the expansion project. She spoke calmly and respectfully before asking a question I never expected to hear. "Mr. Brooks, would you be willing to meet with us before the court issues its final decision? There are some conversations that should have happened long before any of this began." The developer's representatives did not arrive with lawyers carrying thick binders or executives making demands. They arrived with 2 engineers, a project manager, and an attitude completely different from the one I had grown used to. We met in my attorney's office the following afternoon. The project manager introduced himself, thanked me for agreeing to the meeting, and admitted that their company had only recently discovered the ownership dispute. He explained that they had relied on documentation provided during the planning process and had assumed every necessary property right had already been secured before construction agreements moved forward. My attorney listened carefully before placing the certified survey, the recovered county resolution, and the recorded property description on the conference table. The engineers quietly compared those documents with their own development plans. After several minutes, one of them slowly pushed his chair back and sighed. "Every emergency entrance, every utility corridor, and every traffic approval depends on this parcel," he admitted. "Without it, we cannot build what has already been approved." Hearing those words did not make me feel victorious. It reminded me how quickly assumptions could become accepted as facts when nobody bothered to verify the original records. The meeting ended respectfully without any offers because my attorney insisted that ownership had to be resolved before discussing anything else. As we walked toward the parking lot, another surprise was waiting. Linda Morrison was standing beside her car alone. There were no board members beside her, and no attorney speaking for her. She looked tired in a way I had never seen before. She quietly asked whether we could talk for a few minutes. My attorney remained nearby but allowed the conversation to continue. Linda admitted that the board had spent the entire previous evening arguing with one another. Several directors now claimed they had never fully understood the legal opinions presented years earlier. Others insisted they had trusted previous leadership without questioning the documents. Then she said something that completely changed how I viewed the situation. "Someone has to take responsibility," she admitted. "And everyone is trying to make sure it is someone else." Before I could respond, she handed my attorney a sealed envelope. Inside was a formal proposal offering to purchase the disputed parcel for a price that was far below its newly understood value. In exchange, the HOA requested that I resolve the matter privately and agree not to pursue any additional legal claims related to previous board decisions. My attorney smiled politely, folded the proposal, and returned it to the envelope without signing anything. He calmly explained that there would be no private agreement, while ownership remained under judicial review and while questions about past board actions were still unresolved. Linda nodded without arguing because she seemed to know the offer had little chance of succeeding. As she walked away, my telephone vibrated with a message from Susan Parker. She had just learned that another long-time board member planned to resign before the judge released the final ruling. Even more surprising, she believed additional internal meeting notes still existed, notes that could identify exactly who decided to ignore the attorney's original warning years earlier. My attorney looked at me and quietly said, "The property dispute is almost over, Daniel. Now the truth about how all of this happened is finally beginning to surface." The judge released the written decision 2 mornings later, and by the time my attorney called, I already knew something significant had happened because he sounded calmer than he had at any point since this entire ordeal began. He asked me to meet him at his office before reading the decision over the telephone. When I arrived, he handed me the signed order. The court confirmed that the disputed parcel remained under my family's legal ownership because no recorded conveyance or easement had ever transferred those rights to the Homeowners Association. The ruling also stated that planning maps and years of routine use could not replace properly recorded property documents. I read those sentences twice before looking up. For months I had been treated as though I had no choice, yet the court had just confirmed that the most important piece of land in the entire project had never belonged to the association. News of the ruling spread through the neighborhood almost immediately. Residents gathered outside the community clubhouse asking questions the board could no longer avoid. Several homeowners publicly demanded an independent review of past decisions involving legal expenses and development planning. That afternoon another board member resigned, leaving Linda Morrison with little support. Susan Parker called again with one final discovery. While helping former coworkers organize archived storage boxes after the resignations, they located handwritten notes from an executive session held years earlier. The notes confirmed that outside legal counsel had recommended negotiating directly with my father if the parcel was ever needed for future expansion because litigation carried a significant risk of failure. Instead of following that advice, the board voted to postpone any negotiations and proceed under the assumption that future planning documents would eventually solve the ownership issue. My attorney quietly placed the notes beside the court order. "They were told exactly what the law required," he said. "They simply hoped reality would eventually match their assumptions." Later that evening I received another invitation, this time from the newly appointed interim board chair rather than Linda Morrison. The letter contained no threats, no demands, and no legal language designed to intimidate. It simply requested an opportunity to discuss a lawful easement agreement that would allow emergency access and future infrastructure while fully recognizing my ownership rights. Before responding, I visited my wife at the hospital. Her doctors had finally shared encouraging news. Her treatment was progressing better than expected, and for the first time in months she spoke about looking ahead instead of simply getting through another week. I showed her the court order, and she smiled with quiet relief before reminding me of something I had almost forgotten. "Your father never cared about winning arguments," she said. "He cared about protecting what was right." As I drove home, I realized I no longer wanted revenge against anyone. The court had restored the truth, but the neighborhood still needed a practical solution. The following morning I called my attorney and told him we would meet with the new board. We would listen, but only if every discussion started with one simple principle. They would have to recognize my family's rights before asking for anything else. Less than an hour later, the interim board chair replied that every director had unanimously agreed to those terms, and the first formal negotiation was scheduled for the very next day. The next morning I walked into the meeting room with my attorney at my side and my father's original survey resting inside the same worn folder that had survived decades inside the old fireproof safe. This time there were no raised voices, no accusations, and no assumptions. The new interim board introduced every member before anyone discussed the property. Their chairman stood first and said something I never expected to hear. "Mr. Brooks, before we ask for anything, we want to acknowledge that your family's ownership rights were valid all along, and we regret that this was not recognized sooner." Those words did not erase everything my family had endured, but they changed the direction of the conversation. Instead of arguing over who controlled the land, everyone focused on finding a lawful solution that respected the court's ruling. The developer's engineers presented revised plans showing a limited permanent easement that would provide emergency access and utility service without affecting the rest of my property. My attorney carefully reviewed every page, making revisions that protected future ownership, limited construction areas, required environmental restoration after any work, and guaranteed that no additional rights could ever be claimed without my written consent. After several hours, every party agreed to the final language. We signed the easement exactly as my father would have wanted, through recorded documents instead of assumptions. A week later, the county officially recorded the agreement, permanently confirming both my ownership and the developer's limited access rights. Construction resumed only after every legal requirement had been satisfied. The neighborhood finally received the improvements residents had been promised, but this time they were built on a foundation of properly documented property rights instead of misplaced confidence. In the weeks that followed, additional board members stepped down voluntarily, and a community election brought in new leadership committed to transparency and independent legal review before making major decisions. Susan Parker received a personal letter thanking her for preserving records that helped restore the truth. Harold Bennett smiled when I visited his workshop one final time. He looked at the recorded easement and quietly laughed before saying, "Your father knew that paper lasts longer than pride." Those words stayed with me as I returned to the hospital with copies of the final documents. My wife was finally preparing to continue her recovery from home after months of treatment. When I placed the recorded agreement beside the court order on her bedside table, she reached for my hand and smiled brighter than I had seen in a very long time. We never recovered the house we had lost, and strangely, I no longer measured victory by whether we got it back. We protected the land my family had preserved for generations, we proved that the truth recorded decades earlier still mattered, and we showed that patience, evidence, and the law could accomplish what anger never could. Sometimes justice does not arrive by taking something away from the people who wronged you. Sometimes justice arrives when they are finally forced to recognize a right that should never have been questioned in the first place, and that lesson became far more valuable than any house could ever be.